The night shift at Slice of Life wasn't for the faint-hearted, but I'd been at it long enough to find a strange comfort in the solitude of dark streets and quiet corners. My name's Jake, and I've been delivering pizzas for the better part of 5 years. Most nights were a mix of mundane and mildly amusing. Drunken college kids, late-night gamers, the occasional insomniac. But there was always a sense that something darker lurked at the edges of my route. The night started like any other. The pizzeria buzzed with the usual mix of cheesy aromas and clattering dishes. I punched in, exchanged nods with my coworkers, and grabbed my first order, a double pepperoni with extra cheese. Standard fare. The delivery address was a familiar one, an apartment complex 2 blocks away. Easy money. By the time I returned, the rush had slowed, and I leaned against the counter, waiting for my next run. That's when the bell above the door jingled, and a tall, gaunt man stepped in. He wore a trench coat despite the warm evening, and his eyes were obscured by dark sunglasses. He handed over a slip of paper with an address scribbled on it, and left without a word. "Looks like you got a special delivery," Sam, the night manager, said, handing me the order ticket. His tone was light, but I caught a flicker of unease in his eyes. I glanced at the address. It wasn't one I recognized. "Where's this place?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Sam hesitated. "Outskirts of town. Old neighborhood. Kinda run down. You sure you want this one?" I shrugged. A delivery's a delivery. He handed me the order. A meat lover's pizza, extra large. And I was off. The drive took me further than usual, past the familiar grid of streets and into an area where the streetlights flickered uncertainly. The houses here were older, many of them boarded up or in various states of decay. Finally, I arrived at the address, a sprawling, decrepit mansion that loomed against the night sky. The windows were dark, and the front yard was a tangled mess of overgrown weeds and gnarled trees. I parked the car, grabbed the pizza, and approached the door. The wood was splintered and warped, and the knocker, a tarnished brass gargoyle, grinned menacingly. I knocked, the sound echoing hollowly within. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was frigid, a sharp contrast to the warm night outside. "Hello?" I called, stepping inside. The door swung shut behind me with a soft thud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edges of my vision. I ventured deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Portraits of stern-faced individuals lined the walls, their eyes following me with unsettling intensity. I reached what appeared to be a living room, the furniture draped in dusty sheets. A figure stood by the fireplace, a woman in a flowing white gown, her back to me. "Your pizza's here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman turned slowly, and I stifled a gasp. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark voids. She moved with a grace that seemed otherworldly, gliding towards me without a sound. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and echoing as if coming from a great distance. She handed me an old coin purse, the weight of it surprising. "Keep the change." I nodded, too unnerved to count the coins. "Have a good night." She didn't respond, merely turned away and floated back towards the fireplace. I hurried out, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as I stepped back into the night. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of her hollow eyes and the icy chill of the house. Back at the pizzeria, I dropped the coin purse on the counter and recounted the experience to Sam and the others. Their reactions varied from disbelief to nervous laughter, but Sam's expression remained serious. "Jake," he said quietly once the others had dispersed, "next time, maybe think twice about those out-of-the-way orders. Some places, they're best left alone." I nodded, but deep down I knew this was just the beginning. Something had changed tonight, and the shadows of the town seemed a little darker, a little more alive. The following night, I returned to slice of life with a lingering unease gnawing at my mind. The events of the previous evening haunted me, but I tried to brush them off as a figment of an overactive imagination. Besides, rent wasn't going to pay itself. As I clocked in, the familiar hum of the pizzeria provided a semblance of normalcy. The orders were steady, and I focused on the routine, delivering pizzas to regular customers and navigating the usual nighttime quirks. Around midnight, just as I was thinking the shift might end without incident, the phone rang. Sam answered, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he jotted down the details. "Jake, got another one for you," he said, handing me the slip. I glanced at it, my stomach tightening. The address was unfamiliar, and given the time of night, it could only mean another eerie delivery. "Seriously? Another strange address?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Yeah. Came in just like last night's. You good with it?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." I wasn't about to back down now. The drive took me further out of town than I'd ever been. The road narrowed, hemmed in by dense, shadowy woods. The occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves reminded me just how isolated I was. Finally, the GPS announced my arrival. I pulled up to a wrought iron gate, rusted and overgrown with ivy. Beyond it, the silhouette of a mansion loomed, even more decrepit than the last. I squeezed through a gap in the gate and made my way up the weed-choked path. The mansion's facade was a testament to neglect, with broken windows and crumbling stonework. The front door, a massive slab of weathered oak, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The interior was a stark contrast to the outside, impeccably preserved, almost as if it existed in a different time. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. Shadows pooled in the corners, seeming to move of their own accord. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing eerily. No response. I ventured further, each step sending a shiver down my spine. The hallway opened into a grand foyer, dominated by a sweeping staircase and an enormous chandelier that glinted menacingly in the dim light. From the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. A figure stood at the base of the stairs, barely visible in the gloom. As I approached, I realized it was an elderly man, his eyes glinting unnaturally in the faint light. "Your pizza," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me an ancient, weathered bill, far too old to be in circulation. "Keep the change," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I took the bill, trying to mask my unease. "Thank you. Have a good night." He didn't respond, just turned and ascended the stairs with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for his apparent age. I wasted no time in heading back to the front door, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Just as I reached the door, I heard a soft whisper, indistinct but unmistakable. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the foyer. The shadows seemed to pulse, growing denser, more tangible. Panic surged, and I bolted, the door slamming shut behind me as I stumbled into the night. The drive back was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as the miles put distance between me and that cursed mansion. Back at the pizzeria, I recounted the experience to Sam, whose concern had deepened. "Jake, this is getting weird," he said, shaking his head. "These places, they're not right." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. The 2 deliveries were too strange to dismiss as coincidence. Something was happening. Something beyond the mundane. And I had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, it wasn't finished with me yet. As I left the pizzeria that night, the shadows seemed darker, the silence deeper. The normalcy of my night shifts had been shattered, replaced by an encroaching sense of dread. I found myself wondering if some doors were better left unopened. The next night, I walked into slice of life with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with the hours ahead. I kept telling myself that the weirdness of the past 2 nights was just that, an anomaly. But the part of me that thrived on routine and predictability knew better. As I geared up for my shift, the familiar banter among my coworkers did little to ease my mind. Sam gave me a cautious nod, his eyes shadowed with unspoken concerns. The evening progressed in its usual rhythm: order, drive, deliver, repeat. Until just after midnight, when the phone rang again. The moment it did, a collective hush fell over the pizzeria. Sam picked up the receiver, his face tightening as he listened. When he hung up, he didn't meet my eyes immediately. "Jake," he called, his voice unusually grave. "Got another one for you." I approached the counter, the unease in my gut blooming into full-blown dread as he handed me the slip. This address was even more remote. A cabin deep in the woods on the far edge of town. "You sure about this?" Sam asked, his concern palpable. I swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah, I'll be fine." As I drove, the streetlights gave way to darkness, the road narrowing into a single cracked lane surrounded by thick forest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal cry. The GPS guided me to a barely visible dirt path, leading to a clearing where an old, weathered cabin stood. I parked and stepped out, the night air unnaturally cold. The cabin was dilapidated, with moss and vines creeping up its sides. A single dim light flickered inside. I grabbed the pizza and approached, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles. The door creaked open before I could knock. A figure stood in the doorway, an elderly man, his face deeply lined, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Pizza?" I offered, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. He handed me a bill that felt wrong to the touch, as if it were made of something other than paper. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rasp that sent a chill down my spine. I took the money and turned to leave, but something compelled me to glance back. The man was still watching me, his eyes reflecting the faint light like a predator's. Hastening my steps, I reached the car and drove off. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after the cabin disappeared from my rearview mirror. Back at the pizzeria, I recounted the experience to Sam and the others. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and nervous laughter, but I noticed a few of them casting uneasy glances my way. "This is starting to get seriously weird, Jake," Sam said once we were alone. "Maybe you should take a break from these late-night runs." I wanted to argue, but the weight of the past few nights pressed down on me. "I'll think about it," I said, though we both knew I was lying. The night wore on, the pizzeria slowly emptying of customers and staff. I sat in the back, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. That's when I stumbled upon an article about local legends and hauntings. As I read, a pattern began to emerge. Each location I delivered to had a dark history, tales of disappearances and unexplained phenomena. My heart pounded as I pieced it together. The mansion, the cabin, they weren't just old, creepy buildings. They were sites of documented paranormal activity, places where the veil between our world and something else was thin. Just as I was about to share my findings with Sam, the phone rang again. We both froze, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. Sam answered, his face paling as he listened. When he hung up, he didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes told me everything. Another order, another strange address. I sighed, feeling a mix of resignation and curiosity. "I'll take it," I said, reaching for the slip. This time the address was even more unsettling. A long-abandoned asylum at the edge of town, notorious for its haunted past. As I prepared for the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far beyond my control, something dark and ancient that had been waiting for someone like me. The shadows seemed to deepen as I drove, the trees closing in like the bars of a cage. The road to the asylum was overgrown, barely more than a path. As I approached the crumbling building, the sense of foreboding was almost palpable. I parked and stepped out, the silence of the night oppressive. The asylum loomed above me, a dark silhouette against the sky. With the pizza box in hand, I took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, feeling as if I were stepping into the maw of some great, unseen beast. The door opened with a whisper of old hinges, and I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The moment I stepped inside the asylum, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. My footsteps echoed ominously as I made my way down the long, desolate corridor, the pizza box feeling like a fragile shield against whatever horrors lurked in the shadows. The asylum was a labyrinth of decaying rooms and peeling paint, every surface covered in a fine layer of dust. Faded posters and broken furniture lay scattered, remnants of a time long forgotten. As I walked, the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant whisper of the wind through broken windows. I turned a corner and found myself in what must have been the main hall. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, its once majestic banister now cracked and splintered. At the base of the stairs stood a tall figure, shrouded in darkness. My heart raced as I approached, the details of the figure slowly coming into focus. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered nurse's uniform, her skin pale and eyes hollow. She stared at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're late," she said, her voice echoing eerily through the empty hall. I have your pizza," I stammered, holding out the box. She moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the floor towards me. "Follow me," she commanded, turning and ascending the stairs. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, but something compelled me to follow. We climbed the stairs in silence, the air growing colder with each step. She led me to a room at the end of a long corridor, its door ajar. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. The walls were lined with old medical equipment and shelves filled with dusty jars. In the center of the room stood a figure bound to a chair, its head slumped forward. As we approached, the figure stirred, lifting its head to reveal a face twisted in agony. The nurse moved to the side, allowing me a clearer view. The figure's eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of recognition. "Jake!" The figure croaked, its voice weak and raspy. My blood ran cold. It was Sam. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear and anger. The nurse smiled, a chilling, inhuman grin. "He came looking for answers," she said. "Just like you." I turned to Sam, his eyes pleading. "Jake, it's a trap. They feed on our fear." My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The strange orders, the eerie locations, the sense of being watched. It all fit together now. This wasn't just random bad luck. It was a deliberate, malevolent force drawing me in. The nurse stepped closer, her eyes glinting with malevolent delight. "You're part of the ritual now," she whispered, "and there's no escaping it." I backed away, the walls closing in. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to get out, and I needed to get Sam out too. I glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help. My eyes landed on a set of rusty medical tools on a nearby table. Grabbing a scalpel, I turned to the nurse, brandishing it as best I could. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaky but resolute. She laughed, a sound that echoed with madness. "You think you can fight us?" she taunted. "We are beyond your understanding." Desperation fueled my actions. I lunged at her, the scalpel flashing in the dim light. She moved with unnatural speed, dodging my attack effortlessly. But my distraction had worked. I reached Sam, cutting through his bindings as quickly as I could. "Can you walk?" I asked, my voice urgent. Sam nodded weakly. "I think so." Supporting him, I turned towards the door, only to find it blocked by a shadowy figure, its form shifting and indistinct. The nurse's laughter grew louder, more maniacal. "There's no way out," she said, her voice a twisted song of triumph. But I refused to believe it. I glanced around, spotting a window on the far side of the room. It was a long shot, but it was our only chance. "Hang on, Sam," I whispered. "We're getting out of here." With a surge of adrenaline, I propelled us towards the window, the shadowy figure closing in. I smashed the glass with the scalpel, the shards raining down around us. The cold night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. "Go," I urged, helping Sam through the window. He landed awkwardly on the ground below, but he was out. I clambered through the window, the shadowy figure mere inches away. As I hit the ground, I heard the nurse's final chilling words. "You can't escape us, Jake. We'll always be watching." We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I drove us back to the pizzeria in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The realization that this wasn't over, that it would never be over, hung over us like a dark cloud. Back at the pizzeria, Sam slumped into a chair, his face pale and drawn. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that our lives had been irrevocably changed. And for the first time, I felt truly afraid. The days following our encounter at the asylum were a blur of fear and paranoia. Sam and I both knew that whatever malevolent force we had encountered was far from done with us. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every whisper of wind carried the promise of something worse to come. The pizzeria became a refuge of sorts, though the comfort it once provided was now tainted by our shared dread. Despite the tension, business had to go on. The orders continued, and we did our best to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the normalcy shattered when, one night, just before closing, the phone rang once more. Sam and I exchanged a glance, dread filling the space between us. He hung up slowly and looked at me, his eyes hollow. "Another one," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Same type of address. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Where this time?" Sam handed me the slip. It was an address I recognized from my research, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, notorious for its history of unexplained disappearances. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to figure out what's going on and stop it." Sam nodded. "Agreed. But we need to be prepared." We spent the next hour gathering supplies, flashlights, tools, anything that might help us confront whatever was waiting. As we loaded the car, a sense of grim determination settled over us. This time, we weren't just delivering pizza. We were going to face the darkness head on. The drive to the farmhouse was tense, the road winding through dense woods. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows that danced at the edges of our vision. As we approached the farmhouse, the air grew colder, and a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the landscape in an otherworldly haze. The farmhouse itself was a hulking silhouette against the night sky, its windows dark and lifeless. We parked the car and stepped out, our breaths visible in the frigid air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant call of a nightbird. "Ready?" Sam asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Let's do this." We approached the front door, which stood slightly ajar. As we entered, the cold inside was almost unbearable, the air thick with the scent of decay. The interior was a nightmare of broken furniture and peeling wallpaper, each room more decrepit than the last. We moved cautiously through the house, our flashlights casting long, wavering beams that only seemed to deepen the shadows. every creak of the floorboards amplifying our fear. As we reached the back of the house, we found a door leading to the basement. It was locked, but a few strikes with a crowbar broke it open. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, disappearing into pitch darkness. "Careful," Sam whispered as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a cavernous space, filled with old crates and forgotten relics. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. As we approached, our flashlights flickered, casting eerie reflections. "This must be it," I said, my voice echoing strangely. Sam nodded. "What now?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "We need to break it. I think this is a portal, or something. It's how they're coming through." We grabbed the tools we'd brought and began to strike at the mirror. The first few blows did nothing but send reverberations through the room. But as we continued, cracks began to spiderweb across its surface. A low, guttural growl filled the air, growing louder with each strike. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, and a blast of icy wind knocked us off our feet. Dark, shadowy figures began to emerge from the shards, their forms shifting and indistinct. They surged towards us, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "Jake!" Sam shouted, his voice filled with panic. "What do we do?" "Fight!" I yelled, swinging the crowbar at the nearest figure. It dissipated with a howl, but more took its place. We fought with everything we had, using our tools to fend off the shadowy entities. It was like battling smoke, every strike meeting little resistance. But as we destroyed more of them, their numbers began to dwindle. Finally, the last figure dissolved into the air, and a heavy silence fell over the basement. We stood there, panting and exhausted, the shattered mirror at our feet. "Is it over?" Sam asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I admitted, looking around the dark, empty space. "But I think we did it. At least for now." We made our way back upstairs, the farmhouse eerily silent. As we stepped outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a clear night sky. The oppressive sense of dread that had hung over us for days seemed to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of relief. "Let's get out of here," Sam said. And I couldn't agree more. The drive back to the pizzeria was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally arrived, we locked up and sat down, the events of the past week weighing heavily on us. "We need to be prepared," Sam said after a long silence. "In case it happens again." I nodded. "Yeah. But for now, let's just take a breath." We sat there for a while, the normalcy of the pizzeria providing a reprieve the horrors we'd faced. The shadows outside seemed a little less threatening, the night a little less menacing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The darkness was still out there, watching, waiting. And when it came calling again, we'd be ready. For now, though, we had survived. And sometimes that was enough.